Um, we have postponed, so thank you for being here. And this meeting is being recorded for partly for that reason. There are lots of people who wanted to be here but now couldn't be. So just keep that in mind if you um, don't want your camera on or for whatever reason, we won't be offended. Normal sort of Zoom rules apply. So if you're not speaking, please keep yourself on mute, and there'll be lots of time at the end for questions and discussion. We really want this to be a space for sharing of any work you're working on, any questions, ideas as we talk about how our kind of national systems serve people who've been trafficked. So this was meant to be in honour of the UK's Anti-Slavery Day, which is celebrated on the 18th of October. We're now about a week late, but we are still talking about kind of the UK's system, with also I think a bit of a global perspective, as is Kevin's way, and how the system works for people who've experienced trafficking, how it doesn't work, and how we could be doing better. And then, as I said, we will have lots of time at the end for thoughts. So please feel free to put questions in the chat as we go, or to hold them until the end and then pop your hand up, and we will hopefully do lots of discussion before you go back to your working days. So without further ado, Kevin, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. And as Miriam said, can I thank everybody for joining us on a Friday afternoon? I see we have people from, Germany, across Europe, but the furthest away is Cardinal Stephen Brislin, who is in Johannesburg in South Africa. And of course, we have Michel Vethi, the ambassador for the Order of Malta, who is joining us from Geneva. So we've got a bit of a worldwide audience, albeit a small audience, but it is a Friday afternoon. But also, the timing of this is important. Following a meeting yesterday in the British Parliament, talking about the issue of trafficking, and there was representatives there at this meeting yesterday from, different parts of the world, but also from different sectors, as in business, from law enforcement, from government, and from civil society. And in a way, the meeting that I was at yesterday spoke about being a bit of a wake-up call, that where are we in this positioning, in this global position, but also domestically in the UK. And of course, the reason why we are talking about the UK is not just because we're here, but it was one of the leading pieces of legislation. It did have international impact. It was setting an agenda that was moving forward uh, quite ferociously and quite energetically back in 2014 and then 2015. And of course, it had enormous support from the Catholic Church in particular Pope Francis. And, we see that Pope Leo has already spoken about the issue of human trafficking. We need to, work closer with the Vatican again to see how we can really keep the energy that Pope Francis created and perhaps step it up, because the Catholic Church and the ability for the church to open doors to influence, and faith groups in particular across the world, of all sorts of faiths, of all denominations, have played a mighty role historically, and not just now, on issues of human rights and particularly of slavery and modern slavery. And I think that there's never been a more important time for people of faith and the faith community and faith sector to really start to use its leverage, its soft power, its influence locally and globally to make change that's slipping away as we see. But we mustn't let that change deter us. One of the things Pope Francis used to speak about, and I heard him speak about, was the closer you get, the harder it's getting, and the closer you get to evil and to resolving evil, the busier the devil will get. So when you're feeling that resistance, that's when you're closer to dealing with it. And I think we're in a position where we're feeling more resistance now, perhaps, than we have over the last 10 years. But that should not deter us. So I'm going to share some slides now, just really to go through some facts and figures. I won't make it too data centric, I hope, but just really about the issue of human trafficking, and where we are on this agenda, and have we progressed enough? Do we need to reflect? And what can that involve? So if we actually look at the international instruments that are available to us, we have the Slavery Convention of 1926, the Forced Labor Convention of 1930, the Palermo Protocol, the US Trafficked Persons Protection Act, Council of Europe Convention, an EU directive, Labour Convention of 2014, the Sustainable Development Goals, 161 International Labour Organization protocols or conventions, and 180 plus countries that have domestic legislation. But are these working? Well, they're not working if they're not being used. And it's like anything. If you don't use the manual, if you don't use the tools that have been given to you, then whatever you're trying to do will not work. And the Slavery Convention and the Forced Labor Convention, in the first paragraphs, talk about achieving the aims of those conventions in the shortest possible time. And I don't think the authors intended that to be almost 100 years. They were thinking of more 5 years, 10 years in that time. And the plan was that these things would be eradicated, that governments and institutions and businesses would say, we're not tolerating any forced labor or any slavery. And of course, as we see around the world now, the figures are greater than they've ever been. So if we look at that, and I'm going to talk about the the Council of Europe, the Council of Europe Convention, because in the European context and the UK context, this is the one that applies. And this one is mandatory to countries within the Council of Europe region. So that would be 47 countries. And there are countries as well that have voluntarily signed up to it. And what the purpose of it is, and it very much reflects the Palermo Protocol and the EU directive, or the EU directive came after this, it is to prevent and combat trafficking in human beings and guaranteeing gender equality. These are the elements, the first elements that it should be doing. And look at that word prevent. Look at that word combat. It's very clear. And then guaranteeing gender equality. Is what's happening at the moment doing that? Is it preventing? Is it combating? Probably not, particularly the prevent. We'll come back to that. And the thing is, it's to protect the human rights of the victims, to design a comprehensive framework for the protection and assistance of victims and witnesses, again, while guaranteeing their equality, as well as to effectively investigate and prosecute. So this directive, which comes from the Council of Europe, which is mandatory on countries, including the UK, is that being implemented? Can we say that is happening? Can we say we're meeting those standards? And of course, what's the easiest way to say we don't want to do this? Is to opt out of the ECHR. That's one of the things that we're talking about or we're hearing about in the UK. How do you get rid of your responsibilities? Well, rip up the guidance book. And that most certainly cannot happen. And of course, the other thing it's there for is to promote international cooperation. And that's one of the things I think the group that I'm speaking to now, most of the people that I know have done that extremely well, whether it's from the Geneva at the UN, whether it's from Santa Marta Group, whether it's from networks that have come out of Germany and influence in the EU, whether it's work that I know that's being developed in Poland, whether it's the work of the G20, which this year is in South Africa, which was actually heavily attended, the last meeting I went to in Cape Town, by representation of all faiths, but particularly of the Catholic Church, and the assistant to Cardinal Breslin was there, Father Peter John Pearson, giving presentations about the importance of this and why we need international cooperation. So the work is happening, but it's not triggering what it needs to at the moment. So if we look at the Council of Europe directive, it talks about what assistance should be given to victims. And it's very clear what needs to be given. And this is mandatory. And these are standards of living to ensure their subsistence and appropriate accommodation, access to emergency medical treatment, translation and interpretation, counselling, the availability of all of this in a language they understand, assistance to enable their rights and interests to be presented, and appropriate stages at all appropriate stages of the criminal proceedings against offenders, and access to education specifically for children. And of course, children in the international is up to 18 years of age. So it's very comprehensive what needs to be given. And if you look at what the actual directive says, it says shall include at least, not at best, not at most, at least. So in this, it does say at east, but that's obviously a typo, but it should be at least. So this is the minimum standards. And is that happening when we see these support mechanisms implemented around the world, in especially countries that are mandatory members of the Council of Europe? So this is now the last year's report by the US State Department through the Trafficking in Persons report, which I'm sure most people know, but it's where the US State Department, under its trafficking laws, it required the US to engage with every country around the world, or every UN country, to monitor how it was implementing the Palermo Protocol and the processes around that. And whether we like or dislike the what's called the TIP report, it is the only international report. Then it grades countries. Sometimes I believe, and I think most people would agree, even those people in the US, that this can sometimes be political, the grading as to who do the US want to be friends with. But the numbers are numbers that come from countries. They are numbers that come from governments and NGOs in countries. So there is a reliability about these numbers because there is a team in each country and their job is to gather this data. They're always based in the US Embassy, but they have strong relationships with NGOs and statutory agencies. Sadly, a lot of this is being cut back. So let's see what we get next year. But this is the last year's report, which was published only about a month ago. But if we look at the data and we look at particularly victims, so victims identified in 2023, 133,000, almost 134,000 victims were identified. In 2024, that went down over 31,000. So even the victims that are being identified are declining. And that number represents less than 0.2% of victims in the world. So 99.8% of victims are going unidentified. And whilst we need to celebrate and recognize the brilliant work that's being done around the world, and there is some incredible work, if we were looking at this in our own context of, say, healthcare, cancer screening, and we knew there was 100,000 people who needed cancer screening, but only 0.2% of those got screened in a year, we wouldn't be talking about the small number that had their cancer screening. We'd be talking about the 99.8% that didn't. And so we need to reflect on things really clearly, because until we reflect and start to understand what is it that the world has agreed to deliver, as I showed you in the directives, which are mandatory on most countries that are part of this meeting today. Perhaps the only one that isn't would be South Africa. But then South Africa would be aligned to the UN and the Palermo Protocol. So if we take that and we look at the UK and the National Referral Mechanism, I'm going to flick through some data here, but the National Referral Mechanism at the moment, these are the statistics for 2024. There were 20,090 potential victims referred to the NRM. Most common was labour exploitation, with 6,000 of those. The UK nationals made up the largest group of individuals, and 31% of all referrals were children. 31%. So almost a third were children, so 6,000 plus. And the gender, 74% of the referrals were males, mostly reporting labour exploitation. Now, these are facts that the UK has, and that looks really good. But if I were to tell you that almost over a third of those happened in London, and last year, so we're talking again about a 6,000 number. In London last year, 16 prosecutions, not convictions, prosecutions were mounted. 16. Back in 2014, in London, there were well over 100 a year convictions. So why is it there is only less than 20% now happening compared to what happened before there was a Modern Slavery Act? And that was something I discussed last night in Parliament when I look at what the Modern Slavery Act offers around prevention and risk orders. It's not even used double figures in a year, yet there are 46 police forces across England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. If they were all doing one each, 46. So they're not even doing one each. In fact, they're doing one between about every 4 or 5 police forces. And then if we look at what's called negative and reasonable grounds, or negative reasonable grounds and positive reasonable grounds. This is when somebody comes in and says, I believe I'm a victim of trafficking, or a third party says that. And then there's an assessment process. And if you actually look at it, the process, the numbers that are getting negative reasonable grounds at the first point have increased significantly. Look at 2022, a small fraction, or not a small fraction, but a smallish number of those got negative grounds. But now look at it, it's catching up. And it's even worse than that when I show you in a moment. And then again, if we look at the conclusive grounds, which is the final decision, we see a big increase on the numbers that are receiving negative grounds. And it's a bit more detailed than that in a moment, as I'll show you. And then if we look at the countries where people are coming from in 2024, the UK, way up there. You can see there the numbers, very high numbers. And then you see, followed by Albania, Vietnam, Eritrea, Sudan, and the list goes on. And so the UK is the highest number. And we can see in 2024, every country had a rise except for Albania in the numbers of people coming. So, or the numbers of people identified as trafficked. So there is something happening with relation to the way that people are being accepted into the system. And we can see there on this one, and I can share these afterwards, the age difference. And you can see there with the UK, children are the highest number of trafficked, whereas when you go to all the other countries, it's mainly adults. But in the UK, the vast majority, in fact, 3/4 of them are actually children. And then when we look at this, we can see that the data that's there, I won't go into it, but it shows how numbers have changed over the year. But this slide here is the one that really tells a story. If you look at going into 2025, there was 27,000 cases still waiting for a decision. And on average, it takes 2 years for a decision. But if you look at the negative grounds, 17,000 people got negative decisions. So nearly everyone that referred in, now it wouldn't be the same people that get in the negative decisions because some would have been in the system for 2 years, but the amount coming in is almost the amount being rejected. So of the 20,000 that year or last year, 17,000 got rejected, as opposed to if we look at back in the, if we look back to 2014, okay, the numbers coming in were smaller, but then as a percentage, it was less than 10% were getting a negative decision. Whereas when we come up to 2024, it's 75%. getting negative decisions, or more than 75%. And that's a trend that we're seeing, that this crime is being marginalized. And it's being marginalized because it's being mixed in with immigration, it's being mixed in with other issues, and it's not being seen as a crime of vulnerability where humans are used as a commodity and are making money for criminals. So, what is it that we need to do? Well, firstly, we need to understand this. Why is it our NRM in the UK, and I'm talking about this from the UK perspective, why is it our NRM isn't doing what we hoped it would do? Yesterday, I said the NRM is working perfectly in the UK. The model that's been designed is working perfectly. It's just the wrong model. In the UK, it's the Home Office who make decisions. And since the Home Office took over decision making, the numbers of rejections have gone up. There's no other crime in the UK where the Home Office make a decision. And these are people that may need healthcare, that may need lots of support, and yet remotely away from the people in a central place in Leeds, decisions are made on behalf of the whole country. That cannot be right. And it's something I've, spoken about for a long time. Now, thankfully, some boroughs like Kensington and Chelsea, I've been working with them. They are now saying we don't agree with this system, and they are making decisions about children themselves because they have the responsibility, and they're saying their responsibility for child protection outweighs anything to do with the Modern Slavery Act or the NRM, and their duty is to the children. So, and what they're seeing is an increase in the numbers of children being identified, but also the time period being reduced to weeks, in some case 1 or 2 weeks, as opposed to 2 years. So we need to localize this in the context of the UK. That shows, because if you are local, you are dealing with the person. You have that person in front of you. If you need to find out more information, you can ask them. You understand their position. Now, it may be that you've had to put them somewhere that's not local because of their protection, but that's quite rare, not as often as, say, may be portrayed. And of course, the one thing this does is it makes a lot of money, criminal profit, 236 billion at least for criminals around the world. And if we look at some of the emerging crimes that are happening, there is a change in the way that the criminals are working. And we talk about AI, we talk about all these other ways of the way the criminals are working, but they are just using processes that are available to us. And when I say us, I particularly mean the state, but the state aren't using them in the same way. And so, the cost of human trafficking is that lives are destroyed, dollar for dollar, or pound for pound, or euro for euro. It wipes out all of the money that has gone into global development. And we know that global development funds are reducing. It develops a model within business, which is seen as okay. It's a business model that becomes okay. We saw only last week that some of the biggest companies in the UK were buying cotton that came from forced labor in China. But nothing happens to those companies. Nothing is ever done about it. Yes, it may be in the news, but nothing is done about it. And yet, this is a very serious crime. And they are now involved in money laundering because that money that they've made is crime. When we saw Boohoo in Leicester, where their own research done by an eminent King's Counsel, she in her report said there is modern slavery in Boohoo's factories in Leicester. Nothing happened. The Home Office went up there, others went up there, and they had an event where they celebrated the fact that Boohoo were now going to set up this program to try and improve the conditions of their workers. Boohoo have now moved and they've gone to Bangladesh or elsewhere in the world, most of their work. Why were they never held to account? It was a serious crime with millions and millions in money laundering. And if we look only last week, we may have worries about the US, But the US shut down Backpages, which was a site for advertising women. And in the UK, it still operates. And in fact, in some parts of the country, police forces work with Backpages and say, oh, they give us information. Well, what the US did is they put the CEO of Backpages in prison for 5 years. They stripped him of all his money. And now they've set up a process where the women who were advertised on Backpages, who were trafficked, can now get some of that money. And it's a very simple process. And it's being supported by the Bishops' Conference of the United States. So we need to start taking this money from the criminals and giving it to the victims and using it in the fight, because otherwise crime becomes the business model. And if we look at it in the UK, the National Health Service, which has come out with a policy just recently, was involved in forced labor in Malaysia. The hands saving lives in our operating theatre, the equipment needed was made at the hands of people suffering in Malaysia. We see that suppliers to Irish cotton in forced labour in Dunnes, in Pennies. Pennies is actually Primark in the UK. We see it in Shein, one of the most profitable companies that wasn't allowed to float on the stock exchange of the US and elsewhere, and the UK was considering it. Yet it's known that it's got massive amount of forced labour in its supply chain, yet it's really doing well. And of course, then we see it in sports and the construction sector. And this one, the here, I was in Nigeria a couple of weeks ago, and this actually happened while I was there. And this is a new form of trafficking, not that new, but it's called pig butchering. And they have these warehouses. You can see kind of the setup that they have. And what they do is they kidnap people or recruit vulnerable people and hold them in these centers. And this is in Africa and Southeast Asia. And what they will do is in those centers, they will be told, and inside them, they're quite smart, that they are going to do frauds on people in the UK, America, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada mainly the English-speaking countries. And in the UK, for example, a retired police sergeant was subject of a fraud. He handed over his pension because he thought this was legitimate. He lost the whole lot and he took his own life. And there are thousands of victims in the UK as a result of this. So a victim is created in Africa or in Southeast Asia, and again in another part of the world. So these crimes are rife at the moment. They reckon last year it generated 5 billion, and that 236 billion I spoke about doesn't include this. And this is a developing crime. This could be actually prevented if the IT companies got on board, but they're not. And we need legislation to get them on board. Pope Francis in 2017, this was an important announcement he made, and I remember it. He said that we need the resources to combat trafficking and restoring the full dignity to those who's been its victims. And he warned, if we close our eyes and ears, if we do nothing, we are guilty of complicity. Now, that's a really important statement from somebody who was the moral compass of the world, who was renowned for his human rights, as this Pope is, the current Pope. But Pope Francis really took this under his wing. And I remember the first meeting when I saw him speak, he said, we have to lament. We have to lament. We have to learn to cry. We have to carry the responsibility because it's our fault. And I'm not sure that everywhere that happens. We see rejoicing, we see, clapping, we see lots of things going on when we're talking about human trafficking that we might not see when we're talking about other crimes of vulnerability and exploitation. So I think we need to really reflect on what we were told by Pope Francis, but others in the world as well, that we need to get the resources. So how are we going to get those resources? Well, one thing is about prevention. And we need to really start to look at prevention. And we need to start to look at that as I am, with the support of different people around the world, including the Catholic Church, including Cardinal Breslin, who's on this call, around the G20. And we're working with the G20 to generate 30 billion every year in the fight against human trafficking, to start to strip that money away, to start to return that 236 billion to the people who have suffered, to use it mainly and mostly for reparation, but then also in the fight against trafficking, to start to make this something that's globally unacceptable. But when we're looking at the local level and international level, what is it we can do? Well, we need to ask questions of our local leaders, of our police chiefs, of our, in the UK, police and crime commissioners, of our members of parliament, of our councils, and so on. We need to be asking what policy is in place. And we have to know what to do if we see what we believe to be modern slavery. Call someone, the police, Crime Stoppers, the local authority, get it on the record. Because once it's more and more on the record, you do get responses. We need to share information and knowledge in our church, in our work, our social life, and our family. And we need to ask and report to our local agencies, as I said, to get those relationships going, particularly when we talk to parish levels. We're saying, get to know who your local police officer is, get to know who your local councillor is, start asking questions of those who are in places of responsibility. Obviously, we all know about the Sustainable Development Goals and 8.7 and the important role that the church and faith leaders played in securing 8.7, but in securing all of these goals. And they're getting away from our graphs, not just SDG 8.7, but many of them. And we need to be the voice and the activists to make sure these are back on track. I know it's difficult. I know the world is in a very difficult position, but at this moment in time, the requirement of us to do this has never been greater. And of course, as with many of you on this meeting, why do we do it? Well, I've met girls in southern France, in southern Italy, and I say girls because they were 15, who had been trafficked from Eritrea. They were trafficked down to Libya. They were then sold 20 times a day, sometimes, in markets to be sexually raped and sexually abused. Other girls were sold into domestic exploitation. Then, when they had been used enough, they would then earn their right of passage on a small boat to get across to Italy and to Lampedusa. Then, when they arrived in Europe, it all started again because they were being moved to other places of sexual exploitation because the protection wasn't there. They were placed into a centre, but they were soon left on their own. And if that is happening in our developed world, that brings shame on us all. And we need to be able to protect those. But sadly now in the UK, and I think across Europe, and I think maybe globally as well, those girls that I met from Eritrea, they would now be seen as illegal immigrants, as bad people. And how do we get rid of them? That's what their life is worth when you come to the developed nations. That is not a developed nation. That's a nation that's in denial and a nation that really needs to have a wake-up call. So that's why we do it, so that those people that perhaps we'll never meet will actually have protections that will be there for them. And the traffickers will start to feel justice and that we'll start to balance this imbalance that's happening at the moment. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. Lots to think about there. Um, I wonder if anyone's got any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or just to raise a hand. We're a small enough group that maybe we'll just talk amongst ourselves. Anthony.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah. Um, well, thank you for that, Kevin. I'm pleased, as always, to see that you're still going at this. I think I first came across you, first became concerned about this seriously in 2014. I'd been researching it for some time before that, but with with what the Santa Marta Group was doing in those days. But nearly everybody that I've worked with on human trafficking since that time has now died, changed their job, or retired. I've now very few contacts left. I started off with Medai and Caritas Salford. I'm now with UK Welcomes Refugees. Just really to sort of, I've got some sort of a label from which I can advocate and try to change views. Before I go on, just let me say that within the Catholic Church, we had a universal synod, and that was Pope Francis brought that out of Vatican II, and the idea was to ask people to listen and discern and hear what the Holy Spirit was saying about what they should do for a church in the 21st century, very much in the spirit of Vatican II. The results of that synod featured very little on anything to do with Catholic social teaching. I don't think trafficking got a mention, but some people actually said that Catholic social teaching and environmental issues were not important compared with an extension of the existing conservative Catholic faith. What I want to ask Kevin is, I don't know if you remember me, Kevin, but back in 2015, I started a parish bottom-up approach to the Santa Marta bottom-down approach. And you actually acknowledged the recognition of that at the time, but it's a long time ago now. And over the next few years, up until 2019, I was very successful in a lot of ways in Salford Diocese, but I became increasingly aware that no matter how much we did, the actual impact was very slight. Anyway, by the end of 2019, we had got a conference in London which brought in, I think, perhaps 2/3 of the dioceses, with the intention of forming a wider network. With advice of CSAN, we brought in a lot of other Catholic charities that had a trafficking agenda. The outcome of that, which was orchestrated by Luke de Poulford, who at that time was the director of Arise, was to change from networking to partnership. And we agreed a partnership protocol, which was, it was like a legal document, but really it was committing dioceses and Catholic charities to working in partnership and not in competition. And then COVID broke out, and the Catholic Anti-Trafficking Forum, which had been the vehicle for pursuing this partnership idea, went into hibernation for a while. And eventually that declaration was finalised without a signatory, which really effectively rendered it worthless. Our Bishop John said at the time that we must make the partnership declaration work in whatever way we can. But over a period, I lost all my contacts and influence, and that seems to be dead. I would ask, is the Catholic Anti-Trafficking Forum dead, or is it still there? But more importantly than that, is there a prospect for rekindling the idea of diocesan partnership working? I would say diocesan partnership rather than the Catholic charities, because the dioceses are not in competition with each other, whereas the Catholic charities, like any other charities, are. I still feel that with 750,000 regular mass attending Catholics, there is still a possibility for 22 dioceses to work very strongly to raise awareness and action on modern slavery. I don't know if that sounds like a question, but There were two questions in there. Is the Catholic Anti-Trafficking Forum dead? And can we resurrect the idea of partnership work in Catholic dioceses?
Yeah, thank you, Anthony. And there was a third question. Do I remember you? Of course I do. I remember all the work you were doing, and I know you're still doing it. So, uh, and you know, that's so important that people at the grassroots level in parishes and dioceses are doing this work. One of the things that we reflected on with Santa Marta, you know, we're looking at a potential restructuring, maybe looking at the way that it is going into 2026, how that works on, because Santa Marta was obviously working on, you know, international, very high level, and then, you know, grassroots levels. How can we actually work that better? So that's something that's under you know, a lot of review at the moment. And you know, hopefully before the year's out, we'll be able to make some clarity on that. But one of the things around which we've become very aware of is, you know, there is, if we you know, we talk about the 3 Ps or the 4 Ps in trafficking, you know, and I'd say for the church there's two very particular Ps, which is pulpit and prayer. And do we hear this from the pulpit much? And is it focusing in the prayer much? If we're talking about Catholic or, you know, Anglican or many different faiths that, you know, obviously pray. And I think that one of the things that we looked at is, and we'll be releasing it very soon, and thank you to the likes of Max and Miriam who have done the work on making it look professional, is things like, you know, we've got new documents coming out, but we're very much looking at things like the ways of the cross and the stations of the cross as a thing to bring this into the church. Cardinal Vincent is really, you know, he loved the idea of it, and we produced a booklet which will then relate trafficking to our, you know, our, you know, work, that what we do in the church, how we pray, how we look at things. And then we need, which we're starting to work on as well with some American priests, as well as looking at, you know, in the UK, trying to get, you know, some more cardinals involved in it. In the US, obviously, we're very lucky to have Cardinal Brislin. You know, we've got Cardinal Tagley, who, you know, when I meet with him, he very much talks about fighting human trafficking. He says is the living gospel. He says that is the living gospel. And we're joined today by Michel Vuthi, who is the ambassador for the Order of Malta on trafficking. And he is, you know, really improving and engaging across the Catholic Church through the network of the Order of Malta, but also making sure that their networks, and Pope Leo is a member of the Order of Malta, so that's very useful. Um, so exactly what you say, Anthony, is that we've looked at it and we need to be spending a lot more time. Yes, I've just said to you about engaging externally, and that's very important, but we also need to look at how we engage internally and how we get this into the church itself. You know, and sometimes the challenges are, do you look at your own supply chain as a diocese? Do you look at your own supply chain as the Church of England and Wales? Does the Bishops' Conference look at it? And it's always, oh, it's too much. But start somewhere. Everything is too much. And it was one of the things we reflected on last night in the UK Parliament was, you know, can you imagine what it was like for the likes of William Wilberforce, for the likes of Grenville, but also for the likes of the lady in Northern Ireland who uh, started the blockades of sugar coming into Northern Ireland and created so much noise that sugar wasn't allowed to be brought into Northern Ireland. And so sugar had to then come from India, where there wasn't the slavery. You know, we need to have more and more of that. You know, the leadership maybe needs to be sharper, more focused. And we need to become, I think, on this agenda, we always end up negotiating. We always end up compromising when there's no space for compromise on this agenda. And if you meet anybody and they say, are you for or against trafficking? Everyone says they're against it. Yet in the UK, these websites can be there. The US have made them illegal and have shut them down and have now taken all the money and are giving it back to the trafficked people. In the UK, I could go online now, and I did when I did an event recently. And in London, at a certain time of night, within 5 miles of where I was, there was 14,000 websites available for women being trafficked or who are potentially trafficked. So, Anthony, I think you're absolutely right. We need to give energy back to the church in the format that the church operates within. And then within that, then start to show and convince people how to work on that. And Michel Vuthi has been an excellent ambassador for that. He is the ambassador for trafficking, but he's been an excellent ambassador on doing that. So perhaps we can start sharing that with, I know how active Salford has been, and I know how active Bishop John is on many things, including climate. So it may have gone, off the radar a little bit, Anthony, but I think next year you'll see a greater focus. And it's only because of people like you that the agenda keeps going forward.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Anthony. I can see a few people want to speak, and there's also a question in the chat. Shall I start with Sister Helen? Could I start with you, and then we'll come to Michelle, and then we'll come to Rosa's question in the chat, if that's all right? You're just on mute at the moment, Sister Helen.
So,
Sister Helen, you are on mute. We can't hear you at the moment. If you could unmute yourself, that would be great. Thank you. It's very easily done, no worries.
you want me to?
You could, yeah, if you'd like, Michelle, you could start and then
Yes.
we'll come
No.
back to Sister Helen. Perfect.
Oh, thank you very much. I think Sister Helen needs to unmute. But thank you very much for organizing this webinar. And of course,
Sorry.
thanks.
Sorry, Sister Helen, you unmuted briefly and now you're back on mute. Would it be all right? Oh, now you're unmuted.
Yeah, I just need to say
Okay.
I'll go, but Sister Rosalind is there. We had a wonderful meeting last week, interdiocesan, interfaith, ecumenism, in Brighton, and it was a fantastic day. So we're very much alive and active in Ireland and Brighton. So Sister Ros was there and she will give it anything. Thank you very much. I have to go on to another meeting.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you so much for being here. Thank you. Michelle.
Okay. No, thank you very much. Again, thanks to Santa Marta for organizing this meeting. And obviously, Kevin is still going strong. And thank you for his forceful message. And obviously, Father Anthony, you know what you're speaking about. That's a unique opportunity to, again, expand the network, And yesterday and today, so I was in a meeting, you can possibly read this. It was at the Pontifical Urbaniana University, and you had in Rome many people from the Scalabrinians, but you also had the Cardinal Tagli, you had also Cardinal Baggio, you had people from University of Notre Dame, you had witnesses from Afghanistan. You had, I must say, a very interesting exchange. And I think to have people together is really important because then you realize that a lot is being done. Obviously, as Kevin just said, a lot more needs to be done. But we in the Catholic Church and we with also other fellow Christian churches, and actually Bishop Alastair was there, from the Church of England, and there were also other people from other Christian religions. No, I can tell you that things are moving. Things are moving, and I know that also we need to expand the message not only to the UN, not only to regional organizations, but also to academia, because academia, not only Catholic universities, need to do research, need to publicize good practices, because good practices do exist and they should be imitated. And I think what we are trying to do is precisely to say, as you said, Kevin, and as you quoted Pope Francis, that this human trafficking issue is not a marginal issue, should not be confused with migration, should not be also uh, assimilated with faraway countries, be it China, Bangladesh, or other countries, but should be also seen as a stain of the legitimacy of our civilization. And when we, at the end of last century, were celebrating the 50th anniversary of the UN Charter, the 50th anniversary of the UN Declaration on Human Rights, and also of the Geneva Conventions, now it's not anymore a time for celebration, but it's time for mobilization. And that's why I think it's good that we have such a meeting. But Kevin should have said that, but actually we are organizing a conference, and you could all participate online. We're organizing a conference, Kevin Highland, Santa Marta, also the Pontifical Gregorian University, and the Order of Malta on the 10th of December on precisely this, on not celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Palermo Protocol, but actually mobilizing resources in order to better prevent, combat, and actually not only better prevent and combat human trafficking, but better protect victims and help us. And also, yes, the bottom line is we should all pray for victims, for helpers, and for the conversion of traffickers. Okay, thank you very much, Miriam.
Thank you very much. It's great to hear from you. Thank you for being here, and we look forward to the event in December and to sharing about the outcomes of that as well. Thank you. There are a couple of useful comments in the chat, one from Cardinal Brislin, who's had to leave, and a question, Kevin, from Sister Roz in the chat. If you'd like to, are you happy to take that one? To what extent is there interfaith work with Muslims, Jews, Hindu, Sikh, etc., especially those areas from which people are trafficked?
Yeah, thank you. It's really important. I think we heard some there from Michelle that work is going on, and we heard from Sister Helen in Arundel that there is work going on locally. But also importantly, the Interfaith Forum of the G20, which I chair the trafficking section of that. That is actually when we hold those events, and the next one is going to be in Johannesburg at the time of just coming up to the Leaders Summit. So the 18th to 20th of November. At that, we have people from the leadership of the Muslim community, we have Jewish, we have Hindu, we have Sikh, we have many different faiths. We will have, most certainly, I think Cardinal Breslin is going to be there. And the thing is about uniting the strength of faith. And the discussions are so, for me, the discussions that we have there and hearing people speak actually reinforce why faith is important. But the last one that we had in Cape Town, you had people who were rabbis and senior rabbis condemning what was happening in Palestine, saying that this is wrong. We cannot be doing this under the name of faith. And then people from the Muslim community saying what we're doing with Israel is wrong, and we need to come together and come up with solutions. And there was a man there who is a Jewish man who set up a center in Jerusalem, which is all about bringing together the Jews and the Muslims in the region. And I was fortunate enough to be sat next to him when we were having dinner, and hearing his plan, what he does, it inspires you that there are such good people out there, and thankfully there are. But we need to collectively, and I think that's why I've invested in the G20, because whilst the G20 is about economy, it's about security, it's about all these other things, bringing the voice of faith into that on the human trafficking. And Gordon Brown is the advisor who helps me with it, because he was one of the people who established the G20, and he is a man of strong faith. he talks about how it's so important to be speaking at these levels to these organizations to keep the moral compass squarely in the room and squarely when decisions are being made. So so there is, but I do think we need lots more at the grassroots level. We need far more at parish level and diocesan level. You know, I'm talking from the UK and in Ireland. But in Ireland, for example, one of the most simple but humane things that I saw is, you know, in what would be a very Catholic, as anybody here who's Irish would know, community, a Catholic church, which, you know, people may say, well, should be used just for Catholic events, because we have a lot of Ukrainians living in the area. Most of them are Orthodox, and they were coming to Catholic services. Very welcome they were too, but they felt they would like to have an Orthodox service. So the Catholic priest, with the endorsement of the Archbishop of from Thurles, they then used the Catholic Church for Orthodox services, where the Orthodox priest from Waterford comes up, and they celebrate in a Catholic church their Orthodox services. You know, that is proper interfaith working. And, you know, there needs to be far more done. And I see it at schools levels. I'm a governor of a school in Limerick. I see the brilliant work that's being done by principals and the religious sisters still who are engaged in this work about bringing interfaith. You know, the school where I'm the governor now has 20 languages. Turn the clock back 5 or 10 years, it would have had 2, Irish and English. So there is a great deal being done, and we should not forget that, but we need to promote that. So there is a lot being done on interfaith, but we need to make sure it goes down to grassroots levels. A really good question.
Thank you, Kevin. I would agree with that wholeheartedly, and it's a good positive note to end on. I think we will draw this to a close now. As always, feel free to reach out if you've got questions that come up. You've got our email addresses, I hope. You've got a way to contact us. And we will be doing another webinar at the end of the year. Provisional date for with a pencil in your diary is the 16th of December. That one is going to be kind of concluding the year of Jubilee, what's happened in the way of anti-trafficking in that year, and then looking forward. And we hope to have Cardinal Vincent Nichols there for that one. So we'd love to see you all there, and please do promote that in your networks. But you'll hear more about that more specifically nearer the time. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Kevin, for a really inspiring presentation, really challenging as always. And I wish you all the best for the rest of your days. Thank you for the helpful messages in the
Thank
chat
you.
as well. Sorry not to have been able to address everything.
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you, Max.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you. On the way out to see you.